Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to support the Family Assistance Legislation Amendment (Extend Family Assistance to ABStudy Secondary School Boarding Students aged 16 and over) Bill 2019. And I also move the amendment circulated in my name. Do I hand that to you now? Education is critical to improving quality of life and life outcomes. We all believe that. I've heard it said many times, not only in this chamber, but across the whole spectrum of the education arena. I am very fortunate to have come from an education background. I started my career out, believe it or not, something like a very long time ago, I won't say when, in Mount Druitt as a teacher at Lethbridge Park. Here. And we have the member here in the chamber. That really gave me a very clear understanding, particularly in an area back in the late 70s, early 80s, like Lethbridge Park, which was extremely disadvantaged. There was no infrastructure there. It was basically a school and the beginning of a shopping centre. Our social security system has an important role to play to provide the relevant supports necessary to ensure that all children have the opportunity to access education. Unfortunately, in Australia, which is just remarkable, particularly in a nation, a first world nation, a wealthy nation like Australia, not all children have access to an education. And in particular, many children living in remote communities, mostly Aboriginal children, do not have access to secondary education, which is why I have moved the amendment that I have. And I'll speak about that in a moment. So, as I said, our social security system does have an important role to play to provide the relevant supports necessary to make sure that all children have the opportunity to access education. And that is why Labor is supporting this bill, although with the circulated amendments, as I've indicated. There is evidence that the current rules, which withdraw family tax benefits when children at boarding school turn 16, puts enormous financial pressure on some families. And many of the families that we're talking about are very much without the resources and the funds to be able to bear such a withdrawal of family tax benefits for children over the age of 16 at secondary school. The simple fact is that there are really two tiers, Mr Deputy Speaker, of children, Aboriginal children in particular, as this bill goes to the heart of, that access boarding school. There are those children in remote communities that have no secondary school to go to, and their only alternative to go to secondary school is to actually have to leave home and travel often to capital cities or larger towns like Darwin, Broome, Alice Springs and such places. And that is their only alternative. But there is also a group of Aboriginal children that go to elite boarding schools, the Kings and Scots of the world. And this piece of legislation applies to both those groups of children. I have to say that the ideal is a quality secondary education for children in their home community, if that is at all possible, because that makes sure that children stay connected to family, connected to culture and connected to country. However, the reality is that that is not always possible, hence the importance of this piece of legislation. This withdrawing of family tax benefits when a child at boarding school turns 16 does put pressure on families. This has resulted, I'm loath to say, in unfavourable unintended outcomes. Some students and families are forced into withdrawing students from school to maintain access to the family tax benefit and make ends meet. This is an untenable situation and it must be changed, and that's what this piece of legislation goes to doing. As parents know, children do not get cheaper as they get older, and I'm sure that many of us can attest to that. And there are significant costs associated with children that do attend boarding school. Uniforms, shoes, clothes, excursions, pocket money, haircuts, sporting equipment, and the list goes on. Not to mention that a number of the families that we're talking about would also be on income management or on the basics card, which makes things even more challenging in some ways. These costs don't stop just because a child is at boarding school or because they turn 16. ABStudy is important, and I note that this is the 50th year of ABStudy, and I myself, as a secondary student, was in receipt of ABStudy, be it very different to what it is now. But I do remember that as a secondary school student myself. And a Senate inquiry into this bill indicated widespread support for the changes that this bill is going to, which is why it is welcomed by the Labor Party. However, the Senate inquiry did raise a number of other issues that this bill will not change, but does have the potential, if the amendments are supported, to make some difference. It also exposed some issues with the administration of ABStudy, including the following: the lack of secondary school options in local communities or closer to communities. Obviously, that is a major issue for both federal and state jurisdictions. But these are some of the issues that parents raise directly about ABStudy. The complexity of the ABStudy system. There are 7 ABStudy award types or eligibility triggers and 12 separate payments. It seems to me that that could be well simplified. I could outline those payments, but I think people probably know them already. There is also administrative delays in commencing ABStudy payments for children without immunisation or birth certificates. Now, I think that the department needs to become much more realistic and have an alternative view about this. For many Aboriginal children from remote communities, these two things are extremely onerous. Many Aboriginal people in remote communities and many Aboriginal people across the board do not have birth records, and they're extremely difficult to come by. The other thing is that the paperwork or immunisation cards or immunisation records are in a similar vein. So those two issues are something that I'd really encourage the government to focus on in terms of ABStudy. There are administrative ways to deal with this, and I'm sure that it is within the department's ambit to be able to think about alternatives to or ways in which to deal with those particular issues, so that students can commence ABStudy more quickly. A sensible way to do it is to put students automatically on ABStudy and require those records at a later date or as soon as possible. But there is no reason to have the onus on the production of those records and so children can't start. That's something that I would encourage the government to look at very closely. The other thing is something that I think is a communications issue, and it is about the lack of accessible communication with families in remote areas about the actual availability of ABStudy and how it works. That is a communication issue. I'm not saying it by way of criticism. I'm saying that is something that seems to me to be really, really important in the administration of ABStudy. And one would think, particularly in those isolated communities that it is not so difficult. It would also be applicable, I think, in many regional and probably city locations as well. And the other thing is that for many parents, the ABStudy payment is made directly to the school. I'm not arguing about that, but I'm saying that many parents think that the school, in some cases, is not accountable enough for receiving those funds. And it seems to me that schools should be able to meet those requirements, and I'm sure that many do. But for some schools, the payment is not adequate, and I'm talking about a different subject, the inadequacy of payments. In some schools, the payment is not adequate to cover boarding costs. So that might be something that ABStudy could look at carefully, and obviously the amendments that Labor is moving goes to many of the issues that I've actually outlined. The 2019 Closing the Gap report found that school attendance targets was not on track, and that is a target that is so important as I began to change life outcomes for young Indigenous students. The target was to close the gap in school attendance by 2018, which of course was last year. And as a nation, we have missed this target and missed it well and truly. There have been no improvements in school attendance between 2014 and 2018. And it seems to me that the funds that have been spent are very well intentioned, I'm sure, in terms of school attendance, need to be redeployed, and there needs to be a fresh eye on school attendance. I accept, and I've always argued, that there is multiple responsibilities in a child's school attendance. It is a government responsibility, it is a community responsibility, it is also a family responsibility. So it seems to me that there is an awful lot of work to be done in that, because if children are not at school, if they're not attending, then their life choices and chances are going to be very much curtailed. And we're not talking about people that are in the latter years of secondary school. We're talking about right across the school system, and many children are simply lost to the system, and that seems to be something that should be a priority for both state and federal governments. This gap is unacceptable. I don't think there will be anyone that would argue against that. And also the progress is unacceptable, and we all need to do much better. Overall attendance rates for Aboriginal students is 82% compared to 93% for non-Indigenous students. So there is a gap of over 10% in terms of attendance rates. The gap in school attendance is evident from when children start school, as I said earlier. During primary school, the attendance gap was around 8 percentage points in 2018. Attendance falls when students reach secondary school, particularly for Indigenous students, and the attendance gap widens to 14 percentage points. And we all know that the outcomes there in terms of schooling are extremely wide, and in part it is due to the attendance that I'm talking about. In remote areas, school attendance by Indigenous students is lower and the attendance gap is larger. I went to a remote community a few weeks ago and went to one of the schools, and the attendance at that school that day was 30%. Now, that is not acceptable in anyone's terms, and you know, it just is another indication of the challenges in terms of school participation. The 2018 attendance rate for Indigenous students ranged from 86% in regional areas to 63% in very remote areas. In remote areas, as I said, the attendance gap is larger, demonstrated by that particular figure. This week we read reports that the government has cut federal funding to 100 remote community school jobs in the Kimberley region. This is mind-boggling. 100 jobs in community schools in the Kimberley, and yet the government puts up its hands and says this is where we're focusing. And today is a national reminder of National Suicide Day. And the Kimberley, of course, is one of the focus areas for the government in terms of youth suicide. The Prime Minister, I think, has spoken very genuinely about his distress in relation to young Aboriginal children taking their life. So it seems unbelievable to me that where the focus is for this, for the government's suicide prevention trial, which is the Kimberley, that at the same time you would remove 100 Aboriginal workers from community schools in the Kimberley just does not make any sense to me. The funding allowed remote community residents to provide services such as specialised language teachers, ground maintenance and other support roles. We know that remote schools experience many difficulties presented by geographical isolation, as it is, without the added burden of federal funding cuts perpetrated by the government. The schools that we're talking about are in very remote locations, and these locations are where children don't actually have access to secondary school. So it is very difficult to understand why there would be a cut to this particular region of 100 workers in remote community schools. We know that remote schools experience many difficulties presented by geographical isolation, as I have said, so it just is very difficult to understand. Last week was Indigenous Literacy. Last week we had Indigenous Literacy Day, and this year is the Indigenous Year of Language, the Indigenous Languages Year. All Australians should have equal access to literacy resources, especially for those children living in remote communities. First Nation Australians should have the opportunity to learn language and culture. Language and culture are integral to improving Indigenous literacy outcomes. In fact, it is also very true to say that language and culture are integral to life outcomes for First Nations people. And strengthening identity and a connection to culture is imperative to improving Indigenous quality of life outcomes, as I've indicated. And it is really disappointing that the government has ended federal funding for, among other things, these specialised language services. And I call on the Minister and the government to reverse these cuts, to make sure that children have the opportunity to learn in their own language as well as in English. Because there is clear evidence that when children can learn their language, they do better at school. They simply feel at home. And that is the foundation of trust, of exploration, and ultimately of learning. It is also worth mentioning that these remote schools were funded through the government's Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which has come under immense scrutiny from the Auditor-General, who raised serious questions about the administration of the strategy and its funding decisions, which has seen $4.8 billion spent over 5 years. I don't believe the Indigenous Advancement Strategy should be the funding source for positions within, specialised positions within schools. And if it is to be, then there should be an ongoing view to these specialised positions, particularly, as I have said, in the light of access to secondary education, in the light of these very small schools being under-resourced, and in light of the participation rates of First Nations children. Labor is calling on the government to do more, because going away to boarding school is not always the right option for many children. We need to invest in more options at home and closer to home. No one should miss out on a great education because of where they live. And unfortunately, we are living in a nation where this is the case. And I think many people out in the broader community would be absolutely shocked that there are children in Australia that do not have access to secondary education unless they move great distances from their home. I'm not arguing that boarding school isn't important. Of course it is. It's absolutely fundamental. Both the boarding school that many of the children I'm speaking about in remote communities go to, as well as the boarding schools that many Aboriginal students and their families elect to go to in terms of the more elite boarding schools. At least this piece of legislation corrects the anomaly that once a child turns 16 and they're at boarding school, that the family tax benefit will continue. While it suits some students and their families, as I said, boarding schools do not work for others. It takes young people away from family, community, culture and language. And for many young people, this is an extremely difficult transition. In many instances, it exposes them to discrimination and bullying, as we heard in the Senate inquiry into this bill. We need more public and community schooling options for many students that are close to home and culturally appropriate for Indigenous students from remote areas. We also need to make sure that when students go to boarding school, that it is a positive experience. And I have spoken to many Aboriginal students who have or are attending boarding schools through a number of the programs that exist. And they are having positive experiences and they are extremely excited about their future. But we cannot do that at the expense of students and families that elect to remain in their communities. We need to make sure that it is a positive experience, and we also need to make sure that all boarding schools attended by students from remote communities have the cultural understanding to support students. I know that there are many schools that are making enormous efforts in this regard, but in some cases, I'm afraid, it isn't always the positive experience for students that we would want. Going away to school can be tough on any young person. I've never been to boarding school, so I can't talk from experience. Potentially even more so when you are from a remote community and English is your second or third language, which is often the case with many Aboriginal children from remote communities. ABStudy has allowed thousands of students from remote communities to get a great education at boarding school and complete Year 12. If it had not been for ABStudy, in many cases, I know that would not been that Year 12 completion would have been extremely difficult. The changes in this bill are a step in the right direction, and Labor does support them. They will enable more young Indigenous students from remote communities to reach their potential. Every young Indigenous student should be able to write their own story of success and achievement, like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students before them, no matter where they live or what school they go to.
I thank the member.